YouTube too? Okay. So I think we are set. Ok, muy bien. Bienvenidos y bienvenidas a todos y a todas a este 10º encuentro en reimaginar lo humano. Esta serie de charlas en las cuales hemos invitado a varios colegas, amigos y maestros para ayudarnos a repensar, ¿no? En estos tiempos de incertidumbre y de crisis, cómo podemos reimaginar la manera en que nos relacionamos con nosotros mismos, con los demás y con el planeta de maneras más sanas. Y hoy es mi tremendo placer y honor eh, tener la oportunidad de entrevistar a Geshe Thupten Jinpa. Jinpa, thank you for being here. Muchas gracias por estar acá. Y voy a presentar brevemente a Jinpa. Jinpa ha sido bastante conocido a nivel mundial por ser el traductor principal de Su Majestad el Dalai Lama. Eh, eh, Su Santidad, estoy un poquito nervioso, Su Santidad el Dalai Lama por los últimos 35 años, del año 85 más o menos, que traduce. Jinpa fue monje en sus años de juventud, llegó a estudiar grados muy altos, bueno, los grados más altos de enseñanza en el budismo tibetano, el título de Geshe Thupten en Ganden University, Ganden Monastery en el sur de India. Él creció en el exilio y luego se formó a través de la educación occidental en Cambridge, donde hizo su BA, su Bachelor Studies y su doctorado en filosofía occidental y en estudios religiosos. Eso respecto a sus estudios y bueno, su carrera ha sido bastante brillante, ha editado y traducido más de 10 libros con el Dalai Lama, además de ser su traductor principal. Él mismo ha escrito un montón de libros súper potentes e interesantes, dirige el Instituto de Clásicos Tibetanos que se dedica a preservar la cultura, la herencia espiritual, filosófica e intelectual de Tíbet, de la cual vamos a hablar hoy un poquito también. También él es el presidente del directorio del Mind and Life Institute y ha estado presente en muchísimas, yo diría que en todas las conferencias Mind and Life desde hace unos 30 años también. Este diálogo entre contemplativos y científicos de Oriente y Occidente. Y también él es el presidente del Compassion Institute, una institución sin fines de lucro que está dedicada a expandir la educación en compasión a nivel mundial. Así que se imaginarán que estoy un poco emocionado y muy contento de entrevistar a alguien que admiro mucho. So, welcome Jinpa, bienvenido. Bueno, vamos a comenzar este espacio como siempre con un par de minutos de práctica. Vamos a asentar un poco nuestra mente en el presente. Cuando hacemos eso sabemos que tenemos mayor disponibilidad de nuestros recursos para aprender lo que vayamos a aprender hasta ahora. Así que os invito a tomar una postura cómoda y estable. Y os invito a tomar unas 3 a 4 respiraciones profundas de limpieza, inhalando por la nariz, exhalando por la boca. Llenando el torso de aire al inhalar y relajando y soltando al exhalar. Un par de veces más a tu propio ritmo, permitiendo así que la mente se una al cuerpo, que tu conciencia vaya llegando poco a poco al presente. Y aprovechamos este gesto también para soltar tensiones innecesarias en el rostro, en el pecho, en el abdomen. Y desde aquí podemos tomar conciencia de lo que estamos haciendo, conectando con algunos cientos de personas para dirigir nuestra mente individual y colectiva en la dirección del Dharma, de la espiritualidad. Y podemos tomar un momento para apreciar lo que vamos a hacer por esta hora, poder conectar juntos con algunas preguntas fundamentales sobre la vida, sobre el significado del ser humano, sobre el potencial del ser humano. Y podemos finalmente generar la aspiración de que lo que compartamos en esta hora con Geshe con Thupten Jinpa, traiga beneficio a cada uno de los que están aquí conectados hoy y a través de cada uno de nosotros, a nuestras familias, a nuestros amigos, a las personas con quienes interactuamos en redes sociales y así más ampliamente hacia todos los seres. Muy bien. Voy a pasar a hablar en inglés ahora con Jinpa, así que para escuchar la traducción al español y al portugués, vas al botón de interpretación que está abajo y eliges el idioma que necesitas. ¿Ok? Que disfruten mucho. So, Jinpa, thank you for being with us today, sharing this conversation. Do you hear me, Jinpa?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. So, thank you for being here, for joining us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and it's a real privilege and also a joy. Yeah, and at the beginning, I want to express my appreciation to you personally for making these kind of gatherings available, particularly during this time when everybody needs to really tap into their natural impulse for social connections. And while physically we're not able to do this, there is a danger of feeling lonely. And so providing this kind of opportunities and platforms to communicate and interact and also be part of a larger community experience is really powerful. Thank you.
Thank you. So, in this series of conversations, we've been discussing topics like anger, like compassion, equanimity, politics, imagination, and so on. And probably this will be the last one of this year, at least. And I want to tap on the topic of spirituality with you. And you're a man who has spent big part of your life in intimate relation with spirituality, in particular with Indo-Tibetan Buddhism as your home practice and religion. But I would like to start asking you, how could you define spirituality? What is spirituality? And what could be the goal of a spiritual path?
Well, that's actually quite a difficult term. But my own sense is, I understand sort of spirituality in the broader sense of something very profound about very fundamental human yearning to feel connected to something that is bigger than yourself. So whether we want to call it meaning or purpose or the sacred or whatever it is, I think there is something very fundamental in the human nature that really yearns for that deeper meaning, that somehow to really seek something that makes your own existence on this planet meaningful, providing some meaning. And that is very broadly put spirituality. And my understanding is that the many of the forms of spirituality that we see in the form of religion are in some ways a more collectivized expression of that, and then some greater teachers being able to articulate that yearning and the aspirations in a more systematic way. So that's a kind of how but I understand it to be deeply human and part of the nature. Yeah.
I like that. This the search for meaning and connection with meaning, and also to connect something bigger than self. No?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, some people that are here in the call send this question on how, why is it so difficult for many of us to find meaning these days? We see a crisis of meaning. Sometimes it's reflected as mental health issues. We see a big rise in depression and so on. So many people are searching for meaning, and it seems that it's not as easy to find meaning today as it has been in other times in our history as human beings.
That's true. I mean, that's one of the one of the advantages of traditional religion is that a guideline for moral living, and as well as the framework in which you think about the meaning and purpose is quite systematized. So if you happen to be a member of that community, in some sense, the hard work is already done. So, but the challenge now is in the secular age, increasingly the impact of the narrative, in a positive sense, that is offered about meaning by the religious traditions don't really speak to us, to many of us in this particular. And so then human beings, individuals are expected to find that meaning themselves. So that's why a secular vision of human life is in some ways, as Huxley put it, it's living in a brave new world, where, and that is in some ways the cost of also independence, autonomy that we have found. So the choice, along with choice, comes also this uncertainty and openness. So I think that the crisis of meaning is a very understandable fact of secular society, and particularly in a pluralistic world where the world is very integrated and globalized. Then you see so many different narratives, and then which one you choose for is confusing. So, and then in the end, when it comes to spirituality, I think emotion has to play a very important role. You have to feel an emotional connection. It's not a purely rational calculation. You have to really, that particular narrative has to speak to you. So I think search for meaning in today's age is challenging, and that is natural. That's normal. One shouldn't be surprised about it. But then the question is, how do you get that meaning? I mean, here I think teachings like compassion is very powerful, because the compassion already takes you out of your narrow self-concern, and the relationship is prioritized. And then, especially, the relationship is expressed on the basis of connecting with something that is deep in your own nature. So already when you choose compassion as a primary kind of standpoint, a part of the quest for meaning will be, kind of answered there. So I think that's probably the first step that people should, and instead of looking outside and seeking which narrative speaks to me, it's probably a smarter strategy would be the first, explore within oneself, and to connect with that very natural human tendency to connect and compassion, and then try to live from that place. So that's probably, if one is going to adopt this more secular approach of seeking meaning by oneself, I would suggest that's a smarter strategy.
Thank you. So indeed, humans find meaning in feeling connected, of course, and feeling helpful in supporting life of others, and also finding ways of doing something that is meaningful with their time and mind. But there are some people, actually, I think many, that are looking for something beyond the social connection and meaningful activity. And we could call that maybe a spiritual need or spiritual desire, or a longing for something. And perhaps many people that are connected here have this kind of thirst. And so what would you, maybe from your own experience and your own path, or what you've seen in others, what would you suggest is a good way to start looking for a spiritual path for someone who has that kind of thirst?
Um, well, that's actually quite challenging. I think, whatever that journey is, starting from oneself, starting
Mm,
from some kind of exploration of one's own sort of, inner world, has to be
mm,
part of that. And then, of course, once you do that, you will also begin to uncover, the complex world of mind.
mm,
And also, in the process, you will also come to recognize certain things that matter to you,
mm,
and certain things less. So you will begin to see the prioritization in your own life. Because
mm,
normally we don't pay much attention, and something like values, something that matters to you, only comes out when they are challenged or violated. But otherwise, we just don't pay attention. So this kind of self-inquiry is probably the first step. And then, one of the beautiful things about the contemporary society right now is because of the availability of various contemplative tools that are out
mm,
there, whether it is in the form of mindfulness or being in the present. Or so these techniques will really help sort of, find a settled state of mind where let let these answers to the questions that you have come to you rather than chase after them.
mm,
So that I think is a smarter strategy. Um, and then, of course, when it comes to more specific spiritual paths, for example, like in the Buddhism,
mm,
then you have, more advanced levels that you can go. But the initial sort of inquiry really has to be from inside, and then allowing your mind to, because a lot of the inquiries, a deep inquiry cannot take place without arriving at a bit more settled state of mind.
mm,
Because otherwise it's like a sort of a boat that is being pushed around, tossed around
mm,
on a very turbulent kind of lake. You don't have the stability to do anything. Whereas
mm,
once you're able to calm down that, then things that are your strengths and your values and things that matter to you, some that really inspire you, will come up.
mm, mm. Thank you. Um, by knowing you a little bit over the years, Jimpa, and also being in touch with the view of His Holiness over the years, I know that you have such an integrative approach, a respectful approach to other spiritual and religious paths, to the point that sometimes it's hard to press you in, in getting to know. So, what's the specific value? And I really like you to go into this because the more I know the Indo-Tibetan tradition, the more unique it looks to me, and I have a deep respect of what is happening there.
Yeah,
That a specific culture has sustained a spiritual path at the core of its mind,
yeah,
at
yeah.
the culture. So, uh, if you could share some ideas about the specific way the Indo-Tibetan tradition and Tibetans have uh, given a specific shape to the spiritual quest, um, and what's the value of that for the modern day spiritual seeker?
Well, I mean, thank you. The Indo-Tibetan tradition clearly is one of the great living traditions of our world, and the one unique feature of that is the very explicit emphasis on self-inquiry, and using particularly the power of the human intellect. So it's a it you know generally, in often in many cases, religions, when it comes to actual spiritual practice, tend to discourage critical thinking, whereas in Indo-Tibetan tradition, critical inquiry is an integral part of the process of the spiritual enlightenment itself. So I think that is a very important dimension. And the other dimension is, and a part of that is really kind of exploration of the nature of the mind. That's really a big part of the Tibetan tradition. Um, not only developing an intellectual understanding, but in fact also in the meditative practice itself, observing the mind, and sort of adopting this kind of more detached standpoint and observing, like a kind of a theater of your mind and what comes up. And in this way, beginning to understand the underlying dynamics that are part of the mental life. So that, I think, is so inquiry into the nature of mind is a very important part of that. And another thing is that the Indo-Tibetan tradition have come up with quite a good balance between the heart side of the path and the mind side of the path. In other words, I mean, it's often captured in this phrase, union of method and wisdom, compassion and wisdom. And that balance is a really important part of the emphasis of the tradition, that you have, in some sense, you have a two-pronged approach, like you're driving on two paths at the same time, two roads at the same time. And one is the continual cultivation of compassion, connecting more deeply, uncovering, and at the same time combining that with a deeper inquiry into the nature of reality, understanding the nature of reality. And the thing is that as you deepen your understanding of nature of reality through impermanence, through no self, through emptiness, one thing that you will begin to see is a tendency to loosen your strong grip and grasping at things. So there's a sort of a more of a form of an absence of attachment kicks in. But that needs to be balanced with the heart. Otherwise, you might end up in a situation where you'll say, well, nothing really matters because everything is empty. So that is balanced with a very strong emphasis on compassion and bodhicitta, so that the heart, the relationship, and the respect for the actual world that is there, regardless of how philosophically you may explain the nature of existence, the fact is, if a thorn pricks you, it hurts. If you put your finger in the fire, it hurts and burns. So that world is there. So how do you balance the two? And this is why I think probably one of the most beautiful aspects of the Tibetan in the Tibetan tradition. And all along, then we have the emphasis, focus also on the practical applications of these insights on a daily basis, like the Lojong teachings. How to maintain your kind of more regulated states of mind, how to maintain your equilibrium, how to transform every event into a kind of a path to spiritual awakening. So these are, because in Tibet, there was a lot of emphasis on both learning and practice. So we even use the word kedup niden, being a learned as well as an adept. So that is always a sort of a preferred, sort of a vision rather than just being a meditator or just being a scholar. So kedup niden is really the ideal where your practice and the meditative experience is deeply grounded in a deeper understanding of the teachings. And so those are things that make Tibetan tradition quite powerful. But also the Vajrayana side really brings another dimension, which is the use of the body itself in the process of that spiritual practice, which if you look at other Buddhist traditions that are not Vajrayana, it's mainly about the intellect, it's mainly about the emotion, but there's very little about the body role other than the postures that you need to adopt. But in Vajrayana, the body plays a powerful role, sort of including one's sexuality. So I think what we find in the Indo-Tibetan tradition is at least an attempt to really find an approach that integrates every aspect of who we are as a creature, as a human being. And so that's what makes it very powerful. And also in the Vajrayana practice, although unfortunately sometimes this aspect gets abused, but the guru-disciple relationship and the devotion to the guru when it is done well, where it is done where the guru, the devotion to the guru is not really to the person, but really to the ideal, then it brings out all the beautiful things about relationship that is so rich. And so that's another aspect that is brought, but unfortunately sometimes in a secular, broader secular culture, that those, because then the issues of power, disparity and all of this comes up and it gets abused, and then that there are texts which can be, if read literally, can be misunderstood. But otherwise, the basic idea of a guru devotion, bringing that very strong human element, that's even in the mainstream, Buddhism, we have Sangha is one of the three jewels. And the power of Sangha comes through the communication and the connection. And the Guru devotion is one practice that brings out that relationality so powerfully when it's done. So that's what makes the Tibetan tradition actually quite powerful. Yeah.
And actually, when one approaches, at least in my experience, when I approach Tibetan Buddhism, I mean, I'm approaching it for the last 20 years and still it's overwhelming because of the complexity of everything. So rich in methods and in the views, which are so vast, so complex, so rich. And so I'd like to ask you a few things about that. First of all, the Buddhist tradition is not a theistic tradition, and yet we see deities everywhere in temples and iconography. We have Vajrayogini, Vajrasattva, Avalokiteshvara, all the Manjushri, and so on. So what's that all about? What's the meaning of having all these deities?
Well, that's a good question, actually. I mean, Buddhism definitely is not a theistic tradition. But then, as I said right at the beginning, that spirituality is a very fundamental part of human yearning, and that yearning expresses the form of wanting to make a connection with a meaning that is bigger than yourself, something that is greater than yourself. So the impulses for that it gets expressed in the theistic religion is naturally there in human being. But in the case of Buddhism, because it has, right from the beginning, it has been very explicit in being non-theistic, because the Buddha basically said, you're your own master and you're your own savior. So the idea is really, and that's one of the reasons why there is so much complex explanation of the technology of meditation, because if there is no source of grace coming from outside, some powerful divinity, then the hard work has to be done by yourself. So that's why Buddhism really puts the responsibility on the shoulder of the individual. But in Vajrayana, some of that, the outlet for the more yearning for connection with something greater gets expressed through these deity yoga practice. Now, for many practitioners, on a practical level, the deity yoga practice and the devotion to these deities, there is not that much difference from a theistic believer's relationship with God. I mean, the actual experience, actual devotionality and relationship, the nature of the relationship isn't that different. But for the serious yogis, for whom these deity yogas were actually developed, they know that the deities like Avalokiteshvara or Manjushri or Tara or Vajrayogini are really sort of forms that are conceived to help the human mind, because the human mind needs something to latch on to. And the forms are endowed with enlightened qualities, which are essentially visions of your own future perfected state. So that's why in advanced Vajrayogini practice, Vajrayana practice, the deity yoga is not an instance of you as a meditator looking at a deity outside and praying. It's actually you dissolving your ordinary identity and then taking on the, assuming the identity of that enlightened deity. So it's more of an identification. And the understanding here is that it is actually a representation of your future enlightened state of mind. So it's a bit more complex, but the beautiful part of this method is that it does allow the avenue for this natural human tendency for yearning to receive blessing, to make connection with something that is powerful. So these things get expressed in the Vajrayana practice, but the way in which the nature of the deities are understood are very different from the theistic tradition.
And what about devotion in that context? Because in our tradition, if in our tradition, it's more complex than that. But I would say for most of us, if we are devotional, we cut our head, we stop thinking. And if we are analytical, we cut from the heart.
Yes.
So it seems that this path, it's trying to assemble both sides, or even more sides, but you don't cut your rational mind, your analytical capacity when you open your heart to devotion. It's I'm impressed by the amounts of literature that are love letters, to deities and to the guru, like calling the guru from afar and all that literature. It's so. What's the role of devotion, and what's the role of critical intelligence and discernment in the path?
Well, a good approach is to really establish a bedrock of a rational understanding of the Buddhist path. So, and there are some fundamentals: compassion, bodhicitta, nature of impermanence, understanding the dependent origination, emptiness, no self. So these are really, really fundamentals, and also need to have some basic conception of the overview of the path. So the important thing is to establish that bedrock of understanding, which is really your kind of anchor. Okay, and that it's not simply an intellectual understanding, but something that where you have a deep conviction. That, and conviction generally tends to come with emotion as well. So I think establishing that bedrock is really, really important, because that's going to be your saving grace. And that's like the anchor that will never, the boat may swing around a bit, but if there is an anchor, it cannot go far away. It never can get lost. So the anchor really is the bedrock understanding of the Buddhist path. That's why in the Tibetan tradition, there's so much emphasis on learning, reading and studying. Then if you have this, and then when you open up to devotional experience, it can be very powerful. Because there are certain things, experiences that comes from devotional approach, which is very difficult to get to purely through a rational path. So when you are, for example, we know when we are deeply in love with someone, there is a beautiful dimension of unconditionality, in our relationship. There's a joy in the interaction. We are much more alive. Okay. Also, we are much more receptive. So there is a kind of an opening that happens when you're in love. So devotion affects your mind in a similar way. So what happens in a devotional practice is really, in some ways, it's the kind of a letting go of your attachment to your own ego and personal agenda. And without, normally this happens in the Buddhist context through doing meditation on no self, deconstructing the whole concept of self and revealing that your body is not yourself, your consciousness is not yourself, your feelings are not yourself, and going through this very reductive deconstruction process, and then coming to realize that the self that I believe in is just a construct, and then staying in that. That's one way of getting at the ego. But the devotional way of getting at the ego is to really open up
Mm.
And so in some sense, your ego gets eclipsed by the power of that experience, and which then allows you to express those beautiful part of the sort of the caring aspect. And this is why in the Tibetan tradition, we have this literature such as you call them love letters. They're effectively kind of love letters, hymns to Vajrayogini, hymns to Avalokiteshvara or Tara, and they are powerful. And also, some of the most beautiful kind of moving poems were written by disciples when the Lama passed away. There's just of a remembering the guru and calling the guru from afar, and sort of almost sort of taking him to task for saying, why are you abandoning us here, kind of thing. They're really beautiful. And what happens in those situations is that the practitioner is really opening up, letting go of the ego, and allowing whatever comes out in that space. But those experiences really need to be grounded in that bedrock, because otherwise it can get abused, and also and you can get confused too. So I think this is why in the Tibetan tradition it's done in a beautiful way, because there is this grounding. But otherwise it's a power, and we know, for example, when we do chanting. I mean, I grew up as a monk. Some of the beautiful chantings. There's a sort of a stillness and silence of the mind that you experience when you do a group chanting. That is not that easily producible by simply being alone and closing your eyes and breathing. It often doesn't get you there. Whereas when you are in the group of a context of a group chanting and some beautiful verses, and the chant is beautiful, it automatically takes you to that very quiet, silent, still, peaceful state. So that's the power of devotion.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. And I'm getting the sense when I hear you speaking that you're talking about a big openness of the mind and heart as the potential of human beings traversing a spiritual path. So, and you mentioned you resonated with my analogy of the love letters and the calling the guru and so on. So, do you think there is some risk in falling in love with a spiritual teacher, like idealizing your spiritual teacher, that people sometimes could fall into relationship dynamics that are not helpful for the teacher and for the student? As it happens with love relationships, like secular love relationships.
Definitely. I mean, this is, there is no reason why the guru-disciple relationship and interaction should be an exception, because we see that in the context of therapy, therapists and their clients. So where there is a deep opening of heart, and then sort of sharing very intimate and details of your personal life, then the lines get blurred, and people can get confused. So I think this is really important to be aware. One of the things when you are, the psychologists call it projection. So, and one of the things that you need to watch out is that if your relationship is evolving into a form that has a very strong dependency component, then it's a warning sign. So you do want to depend, but over dependency, where to the point where you want to ask pretty much everything important in your life to the gurus, and then it gets problematic. So I think you need to be a bit more vigilant. And also, this is why I think the bedrock understanding of Buddhism is so important, because in Buddhism, self-inquiry into your own, working on your own mind is really crucial. And then, every now and then, and especially, for example, if your relationship with the guru, if a jealousy is creeping in, with the guru's relationship with another disciple, then something isn't quite right. So those are early warning signs that you can watch out for, and also the dependency, the jealousy, and And so those are important things. And also, if you, you know, sort of the relationship with the guru becomes so important that you're willing to give up pretty much everything. Those are beginnings of sort of signs of going in a different direction. So if you're a hermit in the Tibetan tradition, then it's perfectly fine. But those are different time, different context, culture. But now in today's time, I think, and also you have to make sure that the guru that you're relating to really is someone who's, human beings are very complex creatures, but at least whose conscious intention and motivation is always a compassionate one. The guru is not in it for a power trip, because it's very difficult to differentiate. So complex motivations may be part of someone teaching, becoming a teacher, but if the primary motivation of the teacher is to help students, help disciples, and then compassion is part of it. And that motivation will always ensure that from the guru's part, that relationship, the power is not abused. So I think it is important because, when we feel connected to someone at a very deep level, there is a vulnerability that is part of that interaction. If you don't open up yourself, you're not vulnerable to being kind of hurt. But on the other hand, you are also not living because you're shutting up. So it's a sort of in any case, there's an element of risk in it anyway. But as a good practitioner, you need to bring your awareness so that you can observe if there are tendencies which are not constructive are creeping in.
It's tricky, isn't it? If you don't open and be vulnerable, you don't get anything. At the same time, opening up, it's a risk because things happen. And actually, in our modern culture, in our liquid modern culture, many structures have fallen, and we're questioning authorities of any kind. Political authorities are in the ground. Religious authorities are very much questioned. And still, in your path in Tibetan Buddhism, it's said that it's key to have someone to guide you in the process. So, how could modern seekers navigate this paradox of having a deep mistrust of any semblance of authority because of the problems that have arisen with them, and still have a path in which we need a guidance? So what would be your advice?
Well, that's a really a critical question for our time. My own sense is that except for very advanced Vajrayana levels of practices, up to that point, I think it's probably healthier to relate to your guru as a kind of more of a senior colleague, who knows the topic better, who has experience of the teaching, who's there to guide you when necessary. But the bulk of the journey, you need to do it yourself.
Right.
And so there, sort of, it's, even though in the Tibetan Lamrim teachings and many other teachings, they say that you should view the guru as a Buddha and all the rest. But the healthier strategy is to really respect the guru, but relate to guru more as a senior colleague, like a guide who has gone on the path and who's now showing you. But rely more on the texts at the initial stage. Now, they will be more advanced taste, but for many, this will come way, way later. So it's not really even a concern. For example, like if you are at the completion stage practice, like advanced Tummo meditation or Vajra repetition meditation. So then there are very specific elements where you do need to have a different level of relationship with your guru, who embodies the particular qualities of that teaching. But those are very rare, actually. I mean, very few, even get to that stage. So, but until that time, I think the healthier strategy is to, I mean, there is a beautiful statement by one of the Kadamba masters that he says that first you take the person as your guru, as your guide, and then as you evolve, then you make the texts be your guru, and then as you advance further, then finally make your own mind to be your guru. That I think is a sort of and as you get to that advanced stage, then you are even supposed to view your guru's mind and your mind and the meditation deity's mind as inseparable. So essentially what you're learning is you're learning from the nature of your own mind. So I think that and so when you relate to the human guru, then relate more as a senior colleague who is guiding you, and then increasingly shift that sort of trust more to the texts, and then finally to your own realization.
Thank you. So you may be aware that taking a text as a guide for spiritual practice is something quite new for many people. Many people, not only newcomers to these topics, but people that have been practicing Zen or Vipassana. Like, what do you mean by a text being a practice? So, being yourself a big translator of all texts from the tradition, can you explain a little bit the role of a text in practice?
Well, for example, there will be many different genre of text. Some of the texts are quite extensive. They are more like presenting the particular topic and grounding it in a broader Buddhist worldview and making the connections and all of this. So those are really part of the reading and studying that you do, that the bedrock understanding that I talked about at the beginning. But then some texts are deliberately created as practice manuals. So I think those are what I mean when you turn to text. And then when you have difficult questions, then you need to go back to the more extensive text to find the answers, because the answers are not always black and white. Sometimes the answers need to be understood within their larger context. So it's a sort of both texts need to be used, but for your practice, it's very difficult to have the luxury of being part of a community where the guru is living next to you, kind of thing. There are very few opportunities of that. So then, guru will occasionally give you teachings, you take the teachings, but then you are left to your own devices where you are making those teachings come to life through your practice based on a sadhana of some kind. So sadhana is, for example, the structure, the framework within which the Vajrayana practices unfold. And then the sadhanas are practical manuals of the generation stage of that particular tantra. So in order to unpack it, when you have questions, you need to look into the generation stage text, whereas the sadhana is only a practical manual that has been taken out of it. So the relationship with text, happens at many different levels. And in the Vajrayana, then you also need to look at some of the yogis' own writings, experiential songs, because where some of them may have articulated their experience in more poetic language, and some of them in more kind of esoteric, sadhana language. So I think those are complex uses. But I think, if someone is seriously interested in Tibetan Vajrayana practice, then finding a smart strategy is helpful. You establish the bedrock understanding of the overview of the Buddhist path, taking teachings on the compassion, universal, bodhicitta, impermanence, emptiness, alarmment, and so on and so forth. And then the actual practice, you choose a sadhana. whether it is Vajrayogini or whatever. And then you frame your entire practice on that sadhana, because sadhana starts with taking refuge, renewing your bodhicitta vows. So, and then there is every now and then meditation on emptiness in the context of the death, dharmakaya, taking death as a dharmakaya practice. There's a place for meditation on emptiness. So you really use sadhana as the structure. And then, if you have time, then choose specific aspects. And you may chant the sadhana, but then you choose a specific aspect and spend longer time to develop it further. And then this is how, how it's done traditionally. You take many teachings, but you focus on one sadhana. And so that's probably one way of doing it.
So, and many of the practices from the Buddhist path, we've seen like waves of transcultural translation, intercultural translation. We've seen the wave of mindfulness starting that path, mostly thanks to Thich Nhat Hanh and John Kabat-Zinn, among others. Then we've seen and we've been part of a second wave, which is compassion, compassion training, bodhicitta in a secular language, and the Lojong teachings coming to the West and now to the South too, and to Western culture. Do you think there will be something like a third and fourth waves of translation of deeper, more subtle aspects of spiritual practice into Western cultures?
Sorry. I hope so. I mean, I genuinely feel that, one of the teachings that really could be secularized, but that hasn't been done yet, but which is challenging, is really the teaching on emptiness and no self. It's, either you end up creating something that is very intellectual and philosophical, or if it's a popular writing on emptiness, then it ends up being saying, well, thoughts are thoughts, they're not real. So it's sort of, there seems to be nothing in between that really makes you think, oh, that makes sense. So it takes you to a deeper inquiry. I think that is a whole domain which I think has a huge potential. I don't know what form it will take, who is going to be leading that movement. I don't know. The second thing is, although aspects of Lojong has been secularized in CCT, but Lojong as a genre still hasn't been secularized. So and there is a huge amount of resources there in the Lojong. Pema Chodron is probably the one who has been able to bring Lojong into a much larger sort of audience through her very powerful books. But beyond that, I mean, it's still in Pema Chodron's language, it's very tied to Buddhism. It's not really secular in the sense that we understand. So I think there is huge resource there on the Lojong side, and I think the Lojong side could particularly be very helpful as practical sort of approach to living your life in a particular way. That's what makes Lojong very powerful. There's a sort of an ethos, but in the end, Lojong is really about practice, and not just, and Lojong sort of obliterates the differentiation between formal sitting and non-sitting period. Basically, it says your life is your practice. Your life is your practice. So I think that basic idea of your life as your practice that is coming from Lojong, I think there is something very beautiful and powerful there that can be secularized and universalized. And even a Christian, devout Christian, can adopt that. Like CCT, a devout Christian can adopt it. There's nothing that would conflict with one's, personal religious faith. I believe emptiness has been more tricky because emptiness challenges any notion of absolute. So for devout theistic religious believers, emptiness is a tricky one. But for secular person, emptiness is not a challenge. I mean, from that point of view, there's no contradiction. But for Lojong, adaptation of Lojong's, I think there's nothing in it that would conflict, when it is universalized with people from other faith traditions. So I think the Lojong is one area where a lot can be, extracted. And then from the Vajrayana, it's more tricky. I do believe that the specific techniques of pranayama, the energy kind of practices that are coming from Vajrayana, particularly the advanced tantra, there may be aspects of it which can be secularized along the lines of how Indian yoga has been secularized. So they are, and in fact, in the Tibetan language, we call them tulkur. Tulkur is like kind of mechanics. So tulkur is like a machine. So these exercises are really seen as a kind of a mechanical, body-based energy practice. So the energy practice, probably quite a lot of them, even the advanced one, could be. And in some ways, for example, like the Wim Hof breath exercises is adapted from the Tumu, breath awareness practice and the pranayama. And then there are some pranayama practice, which, for example, which involves holding the breath, and it's called the vast breath practice. Those, by themselves, there's nothing religious about them. And a lot of them have potential health benefit. So I think, and also a lot of these yogic practices also have the added advantage of bringing a quiet, settled state of mind through a yogic exercise. So those, I think, can be secularized. And so, there's definitely a lot of resources, but advanced Vajrayana practice themselves, I think it's very difficult to detach from, because Vajrayana has quite a lot of mythology. If you look at Vajra Yogini or Chakrasamvara or Guhyasamaja, the mythology of the yogi who had the vision and whose vision was articulated in the form of a sadhana is a very integral part of that, making emotional connection to the practice. And that is very deeply spiritual and religious. And I don't think you can extract that into a secular space.
And do you think, you spend a lot of your time in other centuries, no? Your mind lived in the 14th century quite a bit with Tsongkhapa, or in the 8th century with Padmasambhava and Atisha in the 10th century and so on. So do you think today, Jinpa, the human mind of the 21st century is able to achieve the fruit of the path? Can we have Padmasambhavas today? Can we have Tsongkhapas today? Do we have them? Are you aware of them being around?
Well, I would look at His Holiness as a powerful example. But clearly it is possible. There isn't any reason why humans in those periods were particularly exceptional, and we are not. There is a general tendency in all spiritual traditions to look for human evolution as a time of degeneration, starting from a kind of a golden age and going down, down, and down. That seems to be a fairly common human storytelling. We find that in the Hindu tradition, we find it in the Buddhist tradition, we find that in the Christian tradition. So it seems to be a fairly common human theme that there was a golden age and somehow we have now strayed the path. I don't believe that. I believe that. But what is different is the ability to maintain our attention. In the old days, there were very little distraction. Today, as a person living in the 21st century, we have a huge amount of distraction. And the discipline that is called for to kind of use our attention resources consciously is hugely challenging. So if you look at someone like Tsongkhapa, that you mentioned that I spent time with him, I just finished, in my book, biography of him came out just at the end of last year. And I knew he was a great practitioner, but what surprised me was that how disproportionately a large part of his time was really in retreat most of the time. It's just amazing that, if you look at some of his letters that written to his students or admirers or benefactors, many of them have in the colophons written from a place of hermitage or retreat. So I think it's really a question of time, and being able to pay quality attention when we are practicing. That is the challenge of our time. But if we do, I don't think we are somehow weaker in our capacity of the mind. The potential is there. And I spend a lot of time translating these texts, and right now I'm in the middle of finalizing the volume on Gelug teachings in the Library of Tibetan Classics. And there's a text on Mahamudra by Panchen Lama, and there's a text on Guru Puja by one of the meditators. And when they are going through the deep kind of advanced descriptions, I feel if I have the time, I could actually, I can almost smell it. So clearly, the the recipe is there. I think it's more the question of time as well as the ability to pay focused attention. Yeah.
So we have hope if we're determined.
I think so. Yeah, and just making sure that the quality of attention we bring is really good. Because if we pay half attention and half distracted, then it is not going to happen. Tsongkhapa has this suggestion that the mechanism by which a genuine transformation takes place at the level of mind is when we are able to maintain sustain a constant mindfulness of the ascertainment of whether it's impermanence or emptiness with a vibrancy of the experience in a sustained manner. So he says it's the quality, is the clarity of the mind, the ability to maintain the stability and continue that constant application of mindfulness in a prolonged period of time. So he is talking about the quality of the awareness, strength of that cognitive mental state, as well as the duration. And he says that transformation is a function of those three.
Thank you. That was very clarifying. And I know we're a few minutes over time. Do you have time for one more question?
Sure.
Just because I know that many friends that are watching this webinar or the video afterwards live family lives, and many of you don't know that you are a father of two girls and you've been married for a while. So many people have this question: how do you integrate, your spiritual path, your spiritual thirst, and desire to connect with this larger view of what a human being is or could be, with the complexity of daily life in a family context, paying bills and feeding people when taking care and all. If you can say a few words about that.
Thank you. That's an important question for me, as I chose to live a family life rather than a monastic life. My own sense is that as much as possible, you should find a way to structure your practice so that it doesn't depend entirely on the formal sitting time. If you rely heavily on your formal sitting time to make the advance in your practice, then it becomes challenging. So I think here the Lojong's advice to make entire life itself a place to practice is a powerful one. So that I think is very, very important. And then, you have to find the right time, because you do need the time. My own formal sitting practice daily is only half an hour. I do a short sadhana, I do silent meditation. But I spend at least an hour every morning before everybody's up, reading deeply. an important text. So I think just making the space, and so you need to be very smart. I mean, especially if you're a family person, you need to be very smart with time, because last thing you want is to say to the kid, I am not available because I need to practice. That is actually problematic, because children, especially the children when they're small, their needs are so immediate, their needs are so important. Who are we to say our personal Dharma practice is more important than the child's need in front of me? So I think having the right attitude and also having less attachment to your own Dharma practice, formal Dharma practice, is really crucial for a family person. Because in the end, what matters is the progress you make with respect to your own personal transformation. And that transformation may not necessarily come only from the formal sitting practice. So in fact, if you are able to utilize your practice in your everyday life, the chances of having a deeper transformation is even greater. Because, when you confront with a challenging situation, you're not able to bring practice and awareness, but you recognize, and then you reframe. Next time, you're more prepared. So in this way, you change. So I think for a family person, thinking that I don't have time is not the right attitude. We have to make the time. And if you're a serious, committed practitioner, having at least 15 minutes to a half an hour daily practice, formal sitting is important, because you do need to get to that quiet space, at least once a day, really. And by creating that structure of a daily quiet meditation is the way to go, because human beings are ritual creatures. So, and that's why ritual is so powerful in the religion. So if we choose a particular time, particular space to do our formal practice, the moment we sit down there, the ambiance will help us to get to that space. And then you do your formal practice. But then the main practice is really when you're able to bring it into your everyday life. And that way, I think, we have to remember in the Tibet's great traditions, the great masters like the Sakya patriarchs of the Sakya school, as well as Marpa Lozawa, they were not monastic members. They were family people. They had children, they raised kids, but they were at the same time great yogis and realized masters. So I think, I don't think we should be stuck with this dichotomy of whether I can be a family man or whether I can be a practitioner. Yeah.
Thank you, Jinpa. That's beautiful. And you have made the time to be with us today. So thank you for doing that. That's fantastic.
Thank you. Yeah. And thank you, Gonzalo. You really have been, amazing in really taking the leadership role and bringing together, and also sharing your own knowledge and experience with a much larger group of people, and with your facility with many different languages. It really makes a huge difference, and particularly in this time, sort of taking care of creating a sense of community where people can share and be part of something bigger, and continue to maintain that yearning for deeper spiritual experience and spiritual meaning. This is really important. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your constant support and inspiration. Would it be possible that you offer a dedication at the end of?
Okay. Yeah.
So
for this, let's just gather our attention, using our breath as the vehicle to anchor our attention, and just simply reflect on where we are right now, how we are feeling, maybe traces of the impact of having participated in this conversation still in your mind. And let us cherish that that we have chosen to be part of this conversation. We have chosen this particular community to express that yearning. And let us dedicate whatever positive energy or merits we may have created collectively by collectively contemplating these very important topics during this hour. Let's dedicate that maybe in one way or another, conditions that will contribute towards something good in this world, beneficial to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Jinpa. Very good to have you here. Thank you for your energy, your thinking, your heart. Thank you. And thank you everyone.
Very much, yeah.
Thank you everyone who joined for this talk and for the whole series of talks and reimagining being human. And see you next time. Take good care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.